Hello, I'm Anthony. Today's the first video in a mini-series where I'm going to discuss my Guitar Tutor application. I use this program an awful lot in my videos and much more in my songwriting. This thing is an essential companion for me when I'm writing music because over the past 30 odd years, every time I've had an idea for something that could help me to write music, I've put it in this program. It first started in 1991 when I wrote the very first version in Fast Basic on the Atari 520. And I know it was 1991 because I was playing Lemmings on the same computer at the same time. The very first version of the program, in fact, was just this chord map at the top of the program. I wanted to be able to select a chord, say for instance A7, and have something that could show me every note that comprised that chord so that I could see different variations on the fretboard, different ideas of how to play it with all of its variations and voicings. That was where the program began, and that's why it's called Guitar Tutor. Since then, it's extended way beyond that. It's really a harmonic friend to me in many different respects and isn't even limited to the guitar anymore. Today we're going to have an overview of the primary interface, and I'm going to show you the main functionality of the application. And in subsequent videos, I'll show you some of the more esoteric options, but today really just a general overview. Just before we begin our breakdown of the application itself, a quick note about availability. Each time I release a new version of Guitar Tutor, I make it available to my patrons and channel members. As a special offer with the release of this series, however, I'm going to make version 2.92 available to everybody. There'll be a link in the description below where you can download this version of the program. So what is it we're looking at? Well, at the moment, we're looking at two fretboards. The top fretboard is the chord map, and this allows me to select any chord I want, and the notes of that chord will be represented. The bottom fretboard represents the currently selected scale. In this bottom section that I'm circling with my mouse here, this is the diatonic map. I can click anywhere in this map, so I just clicked E minor. That chord is now represented in the chord fretboard up above. So we have triads, sevenths and ninths of the currently selected diatonic scale. We have a horizontal view of that scale. So in the lower notes, you can see those are the notes of the scale itself. These upper notes that are grayed out are there to give you some sort of chromatic context because all 12 notes are always represented. And in fact, you can actually bring extra notes in. So I've just engaged the flatted fifth here. So that's now represented on the scale board. We'll have a look at that in greater detail a little bit later. There's some application-wide functions at the bottom, which we'll have a look at today. And over on the left-hand pane, we have various tabs that show me all sorts of different functions, and we'll have a look at that in some later episodes. Today, I just want to deal with the primary functionality of the application. So let's have a look at the scale fretboard in a little bit more detail. You can see that some of the notes are colorized. Red, orange and yellow, representing firsts, thirds and fifths, are always colorized. They're the kind of the central core colors of the application, but they're colorized in zones. So at the moment you can see that the third, the major third of the scale, is orange. But if I switch to a minor mode, the orange note is now the minor third. So this colorized zone, representing any option of third, minor or major, is always going to be orange. It's a similar story with the fifth. Here we have a perfect fifth, which is 7 semitones away from the tonic. But if we have a scale where we have a diminished fifth, then that's still going to be yellow as well. So the application tries as hard as it can to show you some intelligent and useful stuff. If you push it far enough and you find a scale that doesn't make sense in this particular context, one of the harmonic minor scales, for instance, you might very well be able to come up with a mode that pushes the third or the fifth away from the orange and yellow zone. Then so be it. You know, the application is trying as much as possible to show you some useful information. Here are the thirds, here are the fifths. These blue notes represent the sevenths. So we have a major seventh in the major key. But again, let's choose our minor scale, and here the note is now on the B flat. The blue note is on the B flat. Colorized sevenths are optional. If we go into the options menu, you can see we've got sevenths. That's at the top of this list of pickable colorized options because that's the one that I default to. I use that almost all the time. But we also have the option to have sixths, seconds and fourths. And if you do that, the entire scale is colorized, which for my purposes is too much. I don't want to see every note a different color. This is kind of mental overload and has diminishing returns. If, however, I'm working on some practice, let's say for instance where I'm concentrating on sixths, then I could turn some of the other notes off, just have my sixths colorized, and that's useful to me. I can see this thing as I'm playing the guitar, and this acts as a visual reference to me to just help me see all of the sixths in the minor scale across the entire fretboard. Something else that I'll very commonly do, particularly if I'm playing in a minor scale such as the Dorian. The Dorian is very close to the blues scale. One thing it's missing though is the flatted fifth. Well, I can colorize the notes that aren't in the scale as well. So if I select my flatted fifth, now I've basically got a blues scale. Yes, the seconds and the sixths are there as well, so it's like I kind of got extra colour on top of the blues scale, but nevertheless, the ability to add those colorized notes in is really useful and can be very handy from a practicing perspective. So for instance, if I want to do chromatic walk downs where I'm specifically stressing that diminished fourth, then I can colorize that note and I can see where all of those options are. Technically, you can actually disable notes of the scale itself. Let's go back to the simple major scale. Let's say as an exercise, I want to disable all of the fourths. I can simply turn the F off and it no longer represents the fourth notes in the scale. And if you're thinking that's an odd thing to do, well, yes, it is, but sometimes, particularly from a practicing perspective, this stuff can be really useful. It gives you a brand new perspective on the scale, and now I'm seeing different intervals because that fourth isn't there. And it's basically pushing my brain in a different direction. But of course, as a standard practice, you're going to have all of the notes of the scale engaged. Speaking of the scale, there are three of them primarily available. Major, harmonic minor, and melodic minor are far and away the most common 7-note scales. If you want to get absolutely purely technical, only the major scale is strictly diatonic. There's a principle called maximal separation. Don't want to get too far into the theory, but basically the major scale as a 7-note scale is kind of more diatonic than the others. But in more common usage, diatonic really just basically boils down to 7-note scales. So we treat all of these scales as diatonic scales. They've all got 7 notes in. Those notes just appear in different places. So here, for instance, we're looking at the harmonic minor scale. You could think of the harmonic minor scale as a natural minor scale with a major 7. So if I dropped that 7 down to a minor 7, I'd have the harmonic minor scale again. So I enjoy playing with these extra scales as well. In addition to the purely major scale with its modes, the harmonic minor and melodic minor scales also have their own modes. And we get to the modes of the scale from the second drop down. Let's keep things simple actually. I'm just going to jump back to the major scale because it's going to be more familiar to more people. But here are the 7 modes of the major scale. If I pick the 5th mode, which is Mixolydian, now we're looking at the Mixolydian scale. Here's some simple text telling us that we have natural notes for the majority of the scale, but a flatted 7. That information is also represented in this scale bar. This is called the scale bar. This information in bold is effectively fixed. That's just static text. And it's just a useful overview to tell you that here we're looking at the F note, which is the 4th. If we were building compounded chords, however, that would turn into the 11th. And so the 11th is in brackets to denote its function when you're building chords with that note. Every time I select a new scale or mode, select the Phrygian mode, the application has a buffer and it remembers the last scale that you selected. If you go down to this drop down at the bottom of the application, you can see here are all of the scales that I've selected while I've been talking to you. I could select the Mixolydian scale and then click load, and it'll overwrite the scale with the Mixolydian scale. Since I've just mentioned this drop down at the bottom of the application, this is as good a time as any to have a quick look at the other controls. They're very straightforward. First, we have a cluster of radio buttons that allow me to alter the standard size of the application. To a large extent, Guitar Tutor isn't really scalable. I mean, you can stretch the fretboard to make it wider, but as you can see, most of the functions are locked in place. I never got around to developing a purely kind of flow-based control system in this application because I have a very fixed idea of exactly how I want it to look, but sometimes I do want its footprint to be smaller. So there are 2 other modes, the medium mode, gets rid of the left-hand bar, and the tiny mode is going to throw the chord map away. So this is the smallest version of the application. Everything is basically in the same place. It just introduces additional components. Anything that you can do in guitar view, you can also do in keyboard view. So I can engage non-scale notes in exactly the same way I could earlier. Functionality is all identical. Functions at the bottom right of the application allow me to dock the program. In free, it isn't docked. I can do whatever I want with it. If I click TR, which stands for top right, by the way, it's not described anywhere in the application, but that's what it means. It's going to disappear because I have a dual monitor set up here, and it's going to throw the application up to the top right-hand corner of my setup. I've just re-engaged free so that I can drag it back again. BR stands for bottom right, similar kind of thing. It will just anchor it to the bottom right of my view. If you only have a single monitor setup, it'll basically anchor it down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The program's also always on top. It doesn't have to be, it's an option. Here it is. If I disable always on top, now I click on Cubase and the Guitar Tutor disappears. I almost always have always on top engaged. I don't want any application to override this. I want to see this all the time when I'm playing. I generally have this docked at the top right hand corner of my monitor setup, and it's just there permanently. So when I'm writing music in Cubase, I can see the scale map of whatever key I'm playing in at the moment. If I'm playing a piece of music that modulates its key, for instance, this thing that I'm writing at the moment modulates between E harmonic minor and E Dorian, I can clone the application, which will basically create a second copy of it. I can set one of them to harmonic minor and one of them to Dorian. And if both of those were in tiny mode, I can stack them like that, and I might very well stack both of those on the right hand side of my application. Can you see that I've engaged free in order to enable me to do that? So the clone button is just a convenient way of spawning multiple instances of the application. The last state of almost everything in Guitar Tutor is stored. So I'm currently in the Dorian mode. If I shut Guitar Tutor down and then relaunch it, it's still in Dorian mode. It remembers where it was last. And here's the history as well of the scales that I was last working on. For practice purposes, it's sometimes useful to colorize areas of the fretboard, and this is what the highlighted area functionality does. So if I engage that, it's basically now going to highlight all of the frets between 1 and 2. I can change that zone. Let's go between 7 and 9. Alternatively, I can make it highlight strings instead. If I select strings, it's going to reset these two drop downs to different numbers because 7 and 9 is now meaningless. And so I set the strings that I want to operate on. So if I'm practicing a fluid scale that goes up, spanning between the B and the G string, I can basically highlight that to help me to see the only notes I want to play. For this purpose, I just basically want to forget all of the other notes exist. Let's disable the highlighted area. Now I'm going to click a chord in my diatonic chord map. Let's click E7. If I engage chord color, it highlights the notes in my scale bar that represent those colors. So now it's showing me that E is the tonic as far as the selected chord is concerned. It's got nothing to do with the scale. That's why I've kept this function is locked entirely to the scale bar. It's simply representing the currently selected chord in this view. I can individually click single frets in the fretboard. So for instance, if I'm practicing a pattern that uses exactly those notes, I simply click on each of them, and as you can see, it's highlighted them with a thick black line, and it's colorized those notes so that I can really clearly see that specific pattern that I'm playing. There's an option in the menu to monochrome click notes. That's currently engaged, so all of those click notes have turned this slate blue color. If I disengage that, it'll leave them in their native colors, but you'll still get the thick black outline. I can press clear to make all of those outlines disappear. Now let's have a look at the chord scale board. So this is the top fretboard. I'll click on an F, and the chord's updated to show you all the different ways that you can play F. You can also build your own chords If I click G and then drop down my list of chord options, so let's choose, for instance, a major 9. It's now showing you all of the notes of the major 9 chord. From that point, I can alter that chord even further. So if I had a sharp 11 in, that note gets introduced. If I substitute the 3rd for a suspended 4th, that variation takes place. And now you can see, there's only so many different colours I can use here. So in this particular case, it's substituted both of those notes with the same colour because we're operating in kind of chordal zones. Take away those variations by clicking the No Variance button, and we get back to our standard major 9 chord. I'll put myself back in a simple major scale. Quick word about these chord tone buttons. These are really, really straightforward. It's basically when I'm practicing the bass guitar, whatever key I'm currently in, so I'm in C, if I click the triad chord tone button, in fact it's not done anything at the moment, let's give myself an unusual chord. If I press the triad chord tone button, it just shows me 1, 3 and 5 of the underlying key, because very often when you're playing the bass guitar, you want to play those chord tones from the underlying scale. The 7th note chord simply adds the major 7 from the scale. So these buttons are really, really simple. They're not doing anything fancy at all. Finally today, a very quick word about the best fit function. This is something that you don't really ever need to worry about. Over the course of time, I've improved the Guitar Tutor algorithm to the point where it can really pretty accurately determine how best to represent a key. So sometimes you'll get scales, modes, for instance here, Spanish Phrygian has sharps and flats. It does an excellent job of figuring this stuff out for you and keeping the notation technically correct. You can also see that every time I update a scale, the corresponding functions in the chord map also change to reflect that view. There are very rare occasions, and in preparation for this video I couldn't even find one. There are occasions when sometimes in some scales you can represent it in a way that's non-standard. But after spending 10 minutes of trying to find one, I basically gave up. To be absolutely honest with you, Guitar Tutor didn't used to be as good as it is these days at identifying the proper notation for a scale, and so I used to be able to enforce it to say sharps or flats if I knew from a theory perspective that what I was looking at wasn't correct. I might very well be at the point where I could remove this functionality, to be absolutely honest with you, but essentially you can ignore it. Best fit will work the vast majority of the time. And I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Hope you enjoyed this video today. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to check out the link below if you'd like to download a copy of this program. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.